Hi, everybody. I forgot to play my intro music. So here we are. It's Deep Dives with Monica Perez, back with a returning guest, Anthony Raimondo, who is a fan favorite. We did a show at the end of the summer about, of all things, it was the sleeper hit of the summer about water restrictions and the real story behind so-called water shortages in California. But Anthony's my hero because of all the time during COVID when I said, where are the lawyers? The lawyers can beat these policies that are passed without any process. He was there. He saved anybody who wanted to be saved in Fresno from getting shut down. I just love that. I respect it. He's a solid guy. Anthony, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, also, but what people don't maybe realize is that your bread and butter, like your most like where you've done the most work is labor law, right?
That's correct.
And we've talked a little bit about that in past episodes, but when I've been noticing these labor union victories in the news, two of them really stood out as having a similarity. One was the railroad workers, and one was the recent auto workers, where they get a great deal and they go back for more. And when the auto workers guy, whose name is like Sean Fain, which sounds so much like the IRA in Ireland, and he was wearing a shirt that said "Eat the Rich," and he said something like, "We are bleeding these companies dry, or we've squeezed every drop out of them." And to me, that sounds like a setup for making labor unsustainable in some of these industries. And I feel like it's a setup. I smell a rat, and I thought, let me ask you. But you're gonna take us back, right?
Yeah, in order to understand what's happening now, you actually have to have kind of a big picture of the labor union from the time of the original National Labor Relations Act in the 1930s to the present. So we're going to kind of take a broad view of that history with a little bit of context of what came before. Because one of the reasons I'm smiling is because the story of the railroad workers is not the union, getting their piece of the pie. It's the Biden administration breaking the strike. The workers didn't win that strike. The Biden administration broke the railroad workers union. Well, there's collaboration there, which we'll get to
Right.
how that all works. But
Well,
from the workers' perspective, they lost that strike.
really, but didn't
100%.
they get a great contract out of it?
No, they
Oh,
didn't get
okay.
they did not get what they
Really?
wanted, and more importantly, they lost leverage because the White House stepped in and prevented a work stoppage from actually happening.
Okay, because I guess, I mean, I don't know if there was spin in the news, because it sounded like it was a great deal and they were being.
Oh, Monica, you can always believe what the news tells
Are you
you.
telling me that it was propaganda, that I was reading propaganda?
No,
No, but I tried to.
I'm a conspiracy theorist, so you can't believe me.
No, but here's the thing, like, with it's something, if I don't have personal knowledge of it, you can't you can't figure it out really sometimes. Like, there is no truth outlet that will, it's just hard to know.
Mhm. Labor relations, which is the union industry dynamic, is one of the areas of the world that is most commonly misunderstood and most commonly misreported. I mean, it's hard to say most commonly misreported, given that the media lies about virtually
Everything,
everything.
right.
But it's one area that is particularly ripe for propaganda because it's a technical, weird area that most people have never experienced, and the average person knows very little about how labor relations law works, which is really three areas. So this will kind of get into our discussion. Labor relations law, we talk about this as an umbrella, falls into three areas. One of those areas is representation. Okay. Collective bargaining is nothing more than the idea of the workers coming together and using their collective economic strength to even the bargaining table with their employer's superior economic strength to negotiate collective agreement on behalf of that group of workers, hence collective bargaining, right? A union is simply a tool via which an organization that is those workers, they form an organization which is a union, and that union speaks their voice collectively at the bargaining table. Legally, when a union is quote unquote certified or recognized, that union becomes legally the exclusive representative of the workers in terms of their negotiations and any discussions regarding their terms and conditions of employment with their employer. So that question of are they certified or recognized is a legal question. So how they get that status and whether they have that status is a whole body of law. The other body of law is one other body of law of the two of three is collective bargaining, which is what is the actual process of negotiating and forming a formal agreement between the unit of workers represented by the union and the employer. And there's a whole set of rules and ways that all works. Area number 2, good faith bargaining. Area number 3 is what I would call civil rights protections, which is the workers' right, their fundamental right to band together collectively regarding their terms and conditions of employment and their right to be free of retaliation for doing so and intimidation from doing so, right? That's sort of their fundamental set of civil rights in the workplace. Doesn't require a union to have it. In any workplace, if people are listening to this, you want to get in a meeting with your coworkers and have a talk about how unhappy you are about the wage scale. Mm-hmm. Your employer fires all of you, you can file an unfair labor practice charge with the National Labor Relations Board. It's legally actionable. Yes.
When I worked at a bank where your bonus was the majority of your pay for the year, and so if it had a bad year and they wanted to fire a bunch of people, they basically don't pay you till the very last day. And they would pay you what they wanted. So they would rank the class and they would pay the best person much more than the worst person. But there was a rule that you weren't allowed to tell each other what you made, what your number was. And I always wondered if that's
illegal. It's patently illegal. White collar workers have absolutely no knowledge. I mean, most workers have no knowledge of this, but white collar workers, for a whole lot of reasons, just culturally don't think of themselves in these terms. And in that situation, I mean, you see these things all the time in white collar environments, law firms, God forbid. You can't imagine. All these things would be dealt with as things that are illegal under labor relations law, but white collar workers don't really hardly ever pursue those remedies.
I worked, I believe, 120 hours in 1 week. I worked 40 hours in a row once. And I remember thinking, like, there's absolutely no way this is legal. Like, there's no chance. I mean, I liked it. I wanted to. I was glad that I had that opportunity.
Well, whether it's legal or not depends on how they were paying you.
Yeah, no, it definitely, I don't know. At one point I was like, I might not even be getting minimum wage, because it was just too many hours. It was almost all the hours of the week. I mean, it was really messed up. Like, I don't think they do it that way anymore, but I think it was a relic of the cocaine era.
Probably. Well, a lot of the professional environments, banking and law, finance, these things, I mean, are some of the most horrific working environments you can imagine. I mean, someday you and I can have a talk about why my relationship with my partners in the big law firm I was in melted down and I went out on my own. But that's a different story.
That's a good story. I know that story because I don't know if people realize you were not that far from me, not too long ago, and we both made the trip halfway and had lunch together. It was so fun.
It was very nice.
Anyway, so you told me some of these, your personal history, and it's definitely worth talking about. Okay, so keep going.
So anyway, let's rewind in history to why do we even have a legal framework for what is an economic relationship? You're a libertarian, right? You would say, well, employees want to band together for their economic strength. Good, they're doing it voluntarily. Right. Employer has a need for their labor. They have a need for wages. This is perfect libertarian economic tension for the market to work itself out without any interference by the government. Right. Which is the environment that we had, by the way, before any of these labor laws came to pass in the early part of the 20th century. And the problem with leaving that to a very unregulated free market is the employers used their economic strength in that unregulated free market to bring in mercenaries and kill the workers and their families.
What?
If you ever go, you can Google the Ludlow, Colorado mine workers massacre.
Oh, is that the fire?
Where it was a fire and a shooting. It was a massacre.
Wow.
And we had
now they were on the property though, right? They were on the employer's property, were they not?
Oh well, that changes everything about murdering women and children in their
No,
in their beds.
I'm not saying that, but
yeah, I mean there was nowhere else for them to go.
Okay, that's what I was looking for. It's like, why would you be on their property?
The point of this is that we did have in this country a massive problem with a level of economic strife that was becoming more and more violent. Because workers were also fighting back in a lot of these circumstances. And, guns were being fired, homes were being burned, people were dying. It was getting very, very ugly in that point in our history when we were very unregulated. So the point of that is to understand why a social and political imperative arose for the government to do something to stop this violence. And the something that they did, because the workers formed unions, what they called unions, which are very different from what we understand as unions today, which are massive corporate businesses.
Right.
These unions really were groups of workers who, somebody above them had the guts to speak up and they kind of became the leader, and these organizations of people doing the job itself became the spokespeople of their fellow workers.
So the origin was legit. Like it wasn't
Absolutely.
a setup like it is now. Because now I think of unions as the HR department of an industry.
Absolutely. Well, once again, you can't imagine, I'm sure, that something that started out from a place of integrity that actually gained power in its own right could be co-opted by the system to become a tool.
Of course. It's disheartening, but for the brief moment in time when something legit
but the origins of it truly were in a kind of people's revolution out of desperation of poverty and poor treatment and poor working conditions. And yes. I'm not talking about the bumper sticker crap of unions were the people that brought you the weekend and all that bullshit.
Yeah.
I'm talking about at a point in history where in the early days of America as an industrial powerhouse. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm sure a libertarian would tell me eventually the market would have solved this problem if it had been left alone longer.
No, why I wouldn't say that.
You had violence brought into play that there was nothing to temper it with.
I would say that the problem with the quote robber barons and the labor stuff, like from a libertarian point of view, is you had government interfering with the organic, power struggle there. So if you had people,
this is before government interfered.
No, but I'm saying
it was between private parties.
But what I'm saying is when they killed those women and children, if I recall correctly, the government was on the wrong side of that. They did not. I remember the story now that you mention it. So what I'm saying, same thing with like robber barons. When Rockefeller wanted to buy somebody's oil business and they didn't want to sell, he used unscrupulous and illegal tactics that the government went along with instead of protecting the victim. So like an anarcho-capitalist might say, it would have worked out in a totally free system. However, you have a government and the government was corrupted. And that makes it impossible for the markets to clear.
Yeah, but with the markets clear, I still think those robber barons would have killed those people nonetheless. What would have stopped them?
Right.
With an imbalance of power. But anyway, then you're probably going back to origins of lots of things. But at any rate,
yes.
Let's stay on track to where so for whatever the origins of it were, the reality was there was this violence, there was this turmoil, there was this chaos in the country that demanded a political solution. And the political solution was the creation of what we now know as labor law with the passage of the National Labor Relations Act. This created a structure for union representation. It created rules and enforcement mechanisms for collective bargaining. And it created an enforcement mechanism for workers to get legal redress did they face retaliation. And it also has its own system of adjudication.
Have you ever seen this book?
Mm-mm.
only one place of redress, African Americans, labor regulations, and the courts from Reconstruction to the New Deal. I should have read it before, but I only just unearthed it in my books by David Bernstein. I'll read it, and if it's great, I'll send you a copy.
Perfect. So
Anyway,
the National Labor Relations Board has exclusive jurisdiction over all these areas. You cannot go to court. For example, you can't go to federal district court simply to enforce this law. You have to go to the National Labor Relations Board, and they have their own internal system of judges, and they even have an appellate process. And you can get to the federal courts once you've gone through the National Labor Relations Board process. It's a very large administrative agency. On the unfair labor practice part of this, which are violations of federal labor law, they have investigators that come out and investigate these things, and then they have a department that prosecutes unfair labor practices before administrative law judges, who are only NLRB judges. They aren't general purpose federal administrative law judges. They are labor law experts that are solely employed by the NLRB, and then their decisions can be appealed to what is supposed to be a 5-member board. And the idea of the 5-member board initially was there would be 2 representatives from labor, 2 representatives from industry, and 1 kind of disinterested one to keep the board fair. Now, of course, in reality, what always happens with these things, as the executive branch swings one way or the other, each side packs the board one way or the other, and they try to game the system. During Obama, Obama couldn't get anybody confirmed to the NLRB because it requires Senate confirmation. So the board was paralyzed because they didn't have a quorum, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases that they had adjudicated had to be reversed because they decided them without a quorum in violation of federal law.
wow.
So it's an agency that has not been without turmoil in its history, but this was the structure that they created, they thought was going to work. In 1947, they passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which revised the law, much to the chagrin of organized labor, who felt that the law, the details honestly are not important for this discussion, but they felt the law made everything more favorable to employers and less favorable to unions, which is probably true. So where we are now is we have 2 ways that a union can become the exclusive bargaining representative of the workers. One is, union organizer walks into the employer's office and says, I have a majority of your employees have signed authorization cards, which are little cards that say we want to be represented by the union, and we're demanding that you negotiate with us as their representative. And at that point, the employer has the right to say, okay, you're right. They want you. Let's sit down and negotiate, and you're recognized, which can have some implications in the event the employer or the employees want to push that union out. The other way, which is for a long time has been much more common, is the employer says, that's nice, I'm not going to negotiate with you. Then the union's option is to file a petition for certification with the National Labor Relations Board, which triggers a secret ballot election in the workplace. And literally what happens is an NLRB agent will come out and they'll set up a little ballot box. Remember back in the old days, in ancient times, when we would go vote in person, and they had a thing called a voting booth, and it was like a portable canvas booth, and it had curtains, and you went inside and there was a physical ballot and you marked your ballot.
I did that in somebody's house once.
Right.
That's how
Careful,
local.
you're going to age yourself, Monica, because now we have democracy. It's all electronic and remote. You just drop your and like where I live now, it's actually really depressing. They don't even you have no option to vote in person here. They just have drop boxes that are set up around the area. They're like little metal mailboxes, and you just throw your ballot. It's like, really?
I feel like
we're not even pretending anymore.
you might as well just like rub the belly of a Buddha. Like, I hope that my guy, I
call it the suggestion box.
Yes, exactly. Very well put. Yes, exactly.
So at any rate, this is what they would do. A federal agent would come out, and there was a whole legal process to determine, okay, what group of workers are eligible to vote. And there's a whole body of like logistics of like, how do you do an election in this particular place to make sure it preserves secrecy and fairness and nobody gets intimidated. And there's like a walkthrough and you set all this up. I've done this many times in all kinds of different work facilities. And there's a whole technical process for these elections. And then when election day comes, it used to be 42 days from petition to election, which they've cut down significantly now. And in that 42 days, both sides would literally run like a little political campaign. Union organizers would talk to the workers about why they should vote for the union. And someone like me would hire what we call labor consultants, what they call union busters. And we have a set of rules. Both sides have a set of rules we have to follow about what you're allowed to say in a campaign. But historically, the federal courts, even the most liberal federal courts, recognized that this process was supposed to be a vigorous debate in an atmosphere free of intimidation, but a vigorous debate where the employees could hear both sides and make a free and uninhibited choice about whether they wanted union representation. Now, unions always claim that employers just make the whole thing a process of intimidation. I can tell you that in my career, and I've done a lot of these, I've never had an election that I was in control of reversed, and I've only had one that was ever litigated. And that one, initially the ballots were impounded, but we went to the Court of Appeals, the California agricultural thing, so this is a different system. But ultimately, we got a ruling from a Court of Appeal here that the state violated the state and the union colluded to violate the workers' civil rights in the election because they refused to count the votes.
Who paid you? The employer?
In that case,
yeah,
I was working pro bono for the employees.
Wow, pro bono.
That's a whole different story, which we could do one episode on that case alone.
Wow. I think we have touched on that case, but how about on other occasions, do the employers pay you?
Yeah, typically I'd be hired by an employer that, no employer wants to be unionized. This is the reality of it, right?
Yeah.
So I would be hired by the employer. And that can either be something like, hey, they're going to have this union election. I need you to get me through this. And how do I run a campaign? And how do I talk to my employees about this and tell them why I don't think they need a union? In fact, I had an election reversed against a union for intimidating a worker who was trying to talk to his coworkers about why the union was bad. But at any rate, an employer would hire me to do that. An employer might hire me if they're accused of an unfair labor practice as sort of a traditional defense attorney type thing. And then also I'm often hired to conduct the collective bargaining negotiations themselves. Because again, those have legal requirements and their legal documents, and the negotiation process typically, especially the smaller employers, the types that I tend to represent, really need representation in that process. So now we have these structures that are enforced by the National Labor Relations Board, which is an administrative agency that's ultimately a political yo-yo back and forth between the parties. So what's been happening in recent years is the Obama administration, of course, the Democratic Party is very deep in the pocket of unions. And how that developed is we went from these sort of worker revolutionary type organizations pushing back on a very, very oppressive and dangerous economic environment. Over time, and I'll use him as an example because he's such a good one, you had folks like Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa was a truck driver who got involved with the Teamsters at a time when workers were running the union. And he got involved with the union, I think originally probably with some legitimate ideas. But very quickly, people like Jimmy Hoffa, and he's not the only one, they figured out that this union thing was really a good money-making proposition. Because here's the way that it works. And you're going to love this because you have a legal background. So you'll love the way they do things in statutes where, everything's about definitions, right? Mm-hmm. And this is why the wall they create between everyday people and the law is, in the law, they define words that people understand in ordinary life in a way that's completely different. Mm-hmm. So the fundamental
terms of art. That's how I learned in law school. They used to call it, it's a term of art.
The fundamental right that is embodied in all of labor relations law is the workers have the right to join or form unions or to act collectively for their mutual aid and protection and to negotiate their terms and conditions of employment with their employer. Okay, so in other words, they can act together to alter their working conditions and protect each other within their work environment, whether they have a union or not, and they also have the right to do that by forming and joining unions. So workers can talk to each other freely about unions in the workplace, subject to certain rules and limitations. And I'm taking a very far back view here. Within all this, there's lots and lots of technical stuff. And they can organize for unions. Once there is a union that's certified, the employer or recognized, the employer has a legal obligation to bargain in good faith with that union, meaning you have no obligation to agree, but the employer must bargain with the true intention of reaching an agreement, right? So they can't just offer things that are ridiculously low to the union because all they want to do is break the union and they have no interest in reaching an agreement at all. They have to actually genuinely try. And so this has developed into a whole body of litigation of how do we tell when somebody's really trying and not, making offers to the union that are predictably things that they would never accept. Refusing to bargain at all, canceling sessions all the time, and you have to take it seriously, and you really do have to make an effort to do it. And then you have a written collective bargaining agreement. Well, one of the things is because the core of the act is employees have the right, the choice. Because by the way, all the things I just said, they also have the right to refrain from all those things, joining unions, participating in collective action.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Right. They also have in writing, they have the right to refrain. Absolutely 100%.
But they have to pay dues even if they're not members.
We're about to get to that.
Okay.
If there is a union that is certified or recognized, even the workers who want to refrain are still represented by that union because they're in the bargaining unit. The bargaining unit is a term of art for the group of workers represented by the union. This would be the group of workers covered by the union contract. So the balance that we've played, and this is this weird legal definitional thing, is union security, which is you have to be a union member to work here, is legal, except, and every collective bargaining agreement, as you mentioned, requires people to pay dues. How do they do this? The union cannot mandate that a person become a full union member. What does that mean? So the law says, if you read the law, it says a union security agreement requiring a person to be a member of a union is legal as an exception to the right to refrain. However, membership has a special meaning under the law. Membership means they don't have to join the union. Unions have lots of rules, like you can't cross a picket line, or they can fine you, things like that. They can't make you actually join the union as an organization, but they can make you pay the dues and fees that others have to pay because you don't get to have a quote unquote free ride, was this theory, right? Oh, well, if we don't make Monica pay dues, and she's covered by the union contract, she's taking a free ride on all the hard work the union's doing. She's getting all the benefits of union representation, and she's not paying her fair share. So, Monica, you don't want to join the union, you still have to pay dues.
But why can't I just opt out and negotiate my own wage and not get protected by their arbitration?
By law, the union is the exclusive bargaining representative. An exclusive bargaining representative,
and that includes yourself.
A majority of co-work. It's the same reason why you're governed by Joe Biden, because a majority of your fellow co-workers voted or chose through that recognition process to be represented by these people. So it is a service, right? What is a union now? Because the unions now fast forward, unions are now massive corporate organizations that are as big as, any major corporation that you can imagine. They have hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars at their disposal. I mean, these are to an alien, they would be indistinguishable from the Microsofts and Facebooks and Googles. And, these are huge, huge corporate entities that siphon vast amounts of cash in the form of dues out of workers' paychecks, because these dues are paid in the form of a deduction from your check, just like your Social Security, just like your taxes. Every time you get paid, the union gets paid. And you can't Really, the only ability you have to opt out of it is that you can ask the union, and they really don't let people know this. You have a right to demand an accounting that what your dues are being used for is actually representation of you. You don't theoretically have to pay for the union's political activities and other things that are unrelated to representation of you. But of course, it's very difficult to prove that, and they're good at protecting the money part of it. But they bring in vast amounts of cash, and now more and more unions are not necessarily run by workers. They direct workers. Most of the time now, when I'm dealing with collective bargaining, I'm dealing with a union guy who's never done the job that the workers are doing. And many times these people are like left-wing, master's degree in, some sort of, cultural liberal arts sort of thing. And they go to work for the union and say they're representing, well, I know a guy who used to be a friend of mine who doesn't like me very much anymore since Trump. But he works for a union where he represents janitors. He's got a master's degree. He's, grew up as a privileged kid and went to Syracuse University and got a master's degree in, urban planning or something like that. And makes, 80 to 100 grand a year working for a union representing people that make minimum wage who have no education. I mean, the union people typically have a much better wage and benefit package than the workers that they represent.
And is that what it is? It's just a career, or is there, you think, some underlying ideology or agenda that drives people into that business?
I think as much as any college liberal kid spouting, the left-wing dogma. I mean, how much of it is? I mean, they're captured. I mean,
they want to do well by doing good. You know what I mean?
I think some of them probably do genuinely have good intentions. Like, I think a lot. I mean, and some of my conservative friends get mad at me. I actually think the danger of things like the climate change movement is that the kids on the ground that are like gluing their hands to the road, they're sincere.
Yeah, they're true believers. Yeah, is
their brains are captured. They are sincere in what they are doing. They believe we are all going to die if they don't do this.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but the destructive impact is the same whether they, whether they're sincere or insincere.
Well, are unions destructive? Do you think that the dues are worth it, that they get that?
No, I think they are destructive as they're constituted now, because I have never seen a union that's where the workers are getting their money's worth. Essentially, the way that I would describe it to any person who's considering being represented by a union is that it's a fee for service. It's a fee for service entity.
It's a tax. It works just like the government seems.
It's a fee for service, but you can't stop paying for it if you don't like the service.
Right, just like the government.
Right, because if you don't pay the dues, you're fired.
But do you think it's, the UAW, whatever, it seems like they make a lot more money under these collective bargaining than they ever would. Just, a guy who's like standing on an assembly line making $100,000 a year is a lot.
In certain industries like the auto industry, I think it does. I mean, I don't think you can deny that in those industries it has helped certain workers at certain times, but they've also had mass layoffs in those industries.
Right, exactly.
One of the ways that, what you think of as your stereotypical overpaid auto worker, bloated collective bargaining agreement, where the repercussions of those, for example, is more and more of like the parts production has been outsourced to other countries, and American workers have lost jobs because down the line, we're going to pay for this here in our GM plant or our Ford plant. Well, our third-party transmission gear supplier over here in Ohio, we can get that done in Southeast Asia, cut that cost, and that will cover our increasing costs due to the union over here. And the other part of it that you've got to remember when you talk about the auto industry is what a dirty game. You talk about government interference. Your libertarian listeners, as much as I annoy them, will love this story because it's perfect for libertarians. Remember how Obama saved us from the economic crash?
Cash for clunkers. What did he do?
Right. Obama, remember Main Street before Wall Street?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
What did he do? Gave everybody money?
He saved the auto industry from filing for bankruptcy, don't you remember? And saved all those jobs.
If it was, I don't remember. I did not read the news before I had
part of
the radio show. He must have done it in 2012 before I started reading
the economic, our economic salvation from the crash that the Obama administration came up with was among in
His
addition to
first
bailing,
term. His
yeah,
first
yeah,
term you're talking about.
in
Yes, I
addition
did
to
not read the news until his second term.
okay, so in addition to bailing out the banks, he also bailed out the auto insurance industry. And the big story at the time was we have to bail out the auto industry, the auto manufacturing industry. If we don't bail out the auto manufacturing industry, all these workers are they're going to go bankrupt. They're going to go to federal bankruptcy court, and all these workers are going to lose their jobs, and their children are going to starve. So we have to give them government money. So the auto industry got a big fat bailout. Well, why would a Democratic president help the auto industry, especially at that time? Well, they weren't bailing out the industry, they were bailing out the union. Because again, here's a little technical aspect of labor law. A federal bankruptcy judge can terminate a collective bargaining agreement, part of the bankruptcy process. A federal bankruptcy judge has the power to literally rewrite that union contract to make the company sustainable. Because people hear bankruptcy, they don't understand that there's different types of bankruptcy.
Right.
The auto industry was never in danger of like a
Chapter
Chapter
11
liquidation where, you know, they're having a sheriff's auction to get rid of all the
They're selling the chairs. Yeah.
Like, that's not happening, right? It would have been a reorganization.
Right.
Well, as part of a reorganization, a federal bankruptcy judge, without any of the protections of this collective bargaining process, could have said, you're paying your people too much, you got to cut these wages and benefits.
Which is what Detroit should have done with the teachers, and I think they might have. Around that time.
That's probably the biggest reason why they filed for bankruptcy, to be honest with you.
Definitely.
That's what happened in Stockton. That's why the reason why Stockton filed for bankruptcy was to rewrite all of their collective bargaining agreements in the public sector.
Right.
Okay. So where we are now is you have these massive corporate entity unions that have lots of money and lots of political influence and lots of influence within the Democratic Party. The Obama administration was very effective at moving the ball forward. The big thing they thought, the big touchdown they thought they were going to get during Obama was called the Employee Free Choice Act, EFCA, which died on the vine in Congress because they couldn't even get Democrats to go along with it. But what it was going to do is get rid of elections. And so if the union showed up in the employer's office with a majority of signatures, boom, unions recognized, no election, no campaign, workers are represented.
Wow.
Okay. Dues start flowing. There were enough Democrats that were uncomfortable with the idea of taking away the workers' right to vote on whether they would have a union that it never got anywhere. But they changed things at the NLRB level through regulation and case law in ways that were very favorable to unions. They shortened the time between petition and election, as I mentioned. The more time you have, it tends to benefit the employer.
Okay. It's starting to come together for me because what I was trying to figure out is, where is this resurgence in labor union activity coming from? What is the cause of it? It's so bizarre to me.
Well, here's the thing. It's not really a resurgence.
Right. Okay.
Right. So here's what's happening based on, and my source here, I actually looked up this morning, the latest Bureau of Labor statistics I could find, which is for 2022. And I'm going off the top of my head because I should have written it down, but I didn't.
That's fine.
Historically, private sector unionization has been declining precipitously since the 1950s, and that has never been averted. In 2022, that decline continued. It was down to 6% of the private sector is unionized. 6.1% in 2021, which doesn't sound like a big decline, but it's a continued downward trend. Whereas you would think from the media that that's like a reversal, that we've seen this big reversal and this big resurgence. Most notably, fast food, which is also grouped statistically with hotel workers.
Yes.
2%, and it's been flat at 2% for as long as anybody can remember, and it's flat right now.
I have to comment on this. First of all, I don't want to name names because I literally know this person, but I noticed somebody's name. There was someone I knew from an Ivy League school who was working at a fast food restaurant, and I was totally like, "What? That just makes no sense. Like, that person was really ambitious and smart, and this is weird." Then I saw that name in the newspaper as being one of the rank and file underpaid workers looking for a union in that establishment. I was like, oh, that person has been working there for years with this goal. That was my opinion of that. So I think that there's definitely a bigger picture, whatever. There's some machinations behind the scenes. And then the other thing, one of the very first blog posts I ever wrote like 10 years ago was about waitressing. When I think I was 17, um, I worked in a restaurant. I think you get $2 an hour and then the taxes take it. So you get a paycheck that's zero. But the tips I used to get, I mean, I think I made $600 a week, if I recall correctly, and just cash. Like they weren't taking any taxes out of that. And it all the women I worked with basically were single moms. And it was so I was pretty blue collar growing up, and all the guys I knew worked in construction, and the gals, the go-getters, and the gals were waitresses. You could maintain a living, maintain a household with the money you made waitressing. And I've noticed that there's all this movement to have like minimum wages for waitresses, like $15 an hour, and it's spearheaded by the restaurants themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's because there's just so much money on the table, literally, that the surplus is going to the worker. So $15 an hour is like a quarter of 15% of your checks.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's a quarter. And they are just taking that money away and using it to pay the dishwashers and stuff. And
Well,
anyway,
unions in particular, one of the things they hate is incentive-based pay. They want everyone to get paid kind of these flat things like, unions, in agriculture, for example, things like piece rate where people get paid by the box. The workers love it because the ones who hustle make good money. And unions hate it because you have to work harder to make more money and they don't like that. So what ends up happening is because you have these large corporate organizations representing the workers, they're service providers, but they have their own interests. They have their own organizational interests that are not necessarily aligned with the workers. And you see this all the time. I'm in the middle of a collective bargaining negotiation right now for a small company, and the whole thing has stalled completely because of the union. And these workers, the workers sadly are active at the table, but the union is not doing its job for them. And my client's very frustrated, and we're literally stuck where there's nothing we can do because we've given them a proposal that they won't agree to, but they also won't tell us what they want. Like we said, we're willing to do this, and they're saying we don't like that.
well, do they have the same requirement to negotiate in good faith that the employer does?
They do, and I can go file an unfair labor practice charge against them with the National Labor Relations Board, which of course, makes the relationship a lot worse between us.
Right.
But the only real answer to that is that the National Labor Relations Board will just tell them, don't do that anymore. Now, there's some things we can do to move this along in other ways that aren't pertinent to the show. I mean, there are legal mechanisms within the collective bargaining process that we can use to move it along. But I'm just using it as a small example for, I don't want to say I've had no good experiences because I actually have had, experiences here and there. There's one company that I represent that I do their collective bargaining, and it's usually very easy every time it comes up because there's a good relationship there. And there's a union rep there who's a solid guy who is, he's kind of old school. And to him, like, he's very big about like having trust with the employer at the table. Right. And so we're able to work things out with them. And that one works really well. And in that case, I would say the employees are getting their money's worth.
Okay.
In this one though, and I would say more often than not, these guys get into the union because they don't want to do the harder job that they were doing first. And it's kind of an easy gig where you get a lot of job security and they are definitely overpaid, typically compared to the people they represent. And so where we are now is the Biden administration has gone back. The Trump administration, everything kind of stalled. I wouldn't say Trump moved things backwards. He just kind of stalled the pro-union progress.
But the union supported him.
Well, union workers voted for him, but the unions themselves did.
There were some unions who endorsed him. Remember?
I don't recall that. I'll be honest with you.
Hold on. Stand by.
There were some unions that were bitter towards Obama because Obamacare messed up some of their medical trust, because some of their plans had to pay penalties for being Cadillac plans.
What? Say it again.
The Obamacare created penalties for what were called Cadillac plans.
Right.
And the idea was that I believe that the idea was that they wanted to punish companies, or that provided these sort of like executive level plans for higher paid employees
Right.
to help subsidize lower cost plans. But some of the more generous union medical plans got caught up in that, and there was a big bit of tension between the Obama administration and unions over that for a while.
Okay. It says the police union endorsed President Trump in New York. Philadelphia firefighters and paramedics.
I actually should have qualified this at the beginning. What we're really talking about today is private sector unionization. Public sector unionization. Public sector is a whole different animal.
There's a big Supreme Court case coming down on that right now.
Public sector.
Are you aware of that? Yeah.
Public sector is a whole different animal.
Okay, you don't do that at all.
A good friend of mine, James Young, works for the National Right to Work Legal Foundation, and they've spearheaded a lot of the teachers union cases, and they've used the First Amendment very effectively, because when you're talking about a public employer, now you're talking about government action, which triggers all of the Bill of Rights stuff,
right?
With freedom of speech and freedom of association. It's public sector. Public employees are not included under this National Labor Relations Act that I talked about.
Right.
The two big exclusions are public sector employees and agricultural employees are not covered by this federal law.
Okay. So I just to keep people up to date, there is a Supreme Court case being heard right now, and it's because government employees who belong to unions have the right to not be part of the union, but some places have passed laws or enacted policies where they're not telling them they have those rights.
Right. That's the National Right to Work Legal Foundation.
Right. Okay.
That's all those cases
before the Supreme Court right now.
Right. They've used the First Amendment to chip away, because back in the day, in the early days, I mean, even when they first it was FDR signed the National Labor Relations Act initially, and even he was opposed to public sector unionization. The reason that public employees were excluded was that the idea was, no, you don't get to use your collective economic strength to have the right to extort from the taxpayer.
Right.
Right. No, you don't get to. You're taking the idea. They really thought the philosophy was, they believed that giving public employees like the right to organize and the right to strike was like giving people the right to steal from their neighbor. Right. They viewed public employment was supposed to be seen as like a calling, like you're in service. And they saw it as gross that people would like threaten to strike. Like, you're threatening to strike to get more money from your fellow taxpayer. That's your neighbor.
My mother said she knew it was a watershed moment in this country when the teachers unionized. And she said that, and I asked her why, and she said that they were going to model for children that the way to resolve your differences is to walk out and start a fight. She was horrified by that. I'm not sure I completely intuit what she was saying, but she was just horrified at that idea. But I have an important big question, and then I have a few little random things I want to ask you about. One is, and this is what Kelvin's saying, in a few years' time, the only robots and AI will be members of any union. And I think that goes to my idea that, and I might have told you this in a previous show, that my grandfather, when he saw the dock workers really getting a crazy, overly generous union contract, he said they are working themselves out of not only a job, but an industry. And at that time, and he said that, this is my father telling me, 95% of all shipping in the whole world went through U.S. ports. And over time, that's now, I mean, we're not like you don't even see people registered here. And then I also noticed that in the 50s, they created what is possibly the greatest wealth maker of all time, which is the cargo container, the shipping container. And I always wondered in the back of my mind if this was true, but if not, it is an example of what might might be happening now, which is if the stevedores were asking so much, the companies couldn't be blamed for firing them all and refitting for shipping containers. And I wonder if that's
So,
what's happening with the
well,
UAW now.
you asked me if unions are destructive to the workers or helpful to the workers, and the better answer to that question is really to look at what's happened. And I think, short term you might have auto workers that are overpaid, but long term what has happened to American manufacturing, right?
Right.
Look at the 1950s when we were at the peak of private sector unionization in the United States. Well, so that's when unions really had their strongest grip on their influence on the American industrial economy. What has happened to the American industrial economy from 1950 to today?
Right.
Certainly, they played a part in that, right? You're telling me and I'm not suggesting the government has certainly played their role.
Clinton said
both Republican and Democrat. But
let me just say,
Clinton
said, hold on, Clinton said that NAFTA, his goal with NAFTA was to make the U.S. economy a service economy, put the last nail in the coffin and the industrial economy.
But unions happily held hand in hand with the government and skipped us down that road.
Right.
I mean, they have their share of responsibility in it, and they have a heavy amount of political influence, especially within the Democratic Party. And the automation question, by the way, which was a great one, is a good example of this, because that's also a combination of union and government, because you have the union influence in government, and all you have to do is look at California, where unions have a tremendous amount of influence. One of the biggest things that's driving automation in California is the rising minimum wage, which is not a union issue. It's a government issue. It's going to be $16 an hour come January.
I have to tell you this.
And so you have, I have a client who has an agricultural processing facility. Okay. So they have a lot of unskilled labor, especially quality control, people who look at the product as it moves along these lines, and they literally hand pull out, because these are ag products, the things that don't look good, right? That are quality issues. They're automating all that into robots. And he told me, he's like, the minute they said it was a $15 minimum wage, I picked up the phone to put capital towards investing in robots and automation. So, you see Gavin Newsom pushing minimum wage to $16 an hour and a $20 an hour fast food minimum wage. You're not going to see a fast food worker in 5 years.
Right. So this experience I had recently, and I've told you before about my blueberry farmers in Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
They're in Portland city limits, believe it or not, even though they're on an island between two rivers. It's actually quite beautiful. And they've given up they were certified as organic blueberry farmers, which is a process and it has value. And they lease their farmland now to potato growers for potato chips, because once Portland passed that $15 an hour minimum wage, they no longer could hire people to pick blueberries. Then I've said that before, but I was just in Whole Foods the other day, and there's organic blueberries there, and they were from Peru. I mean, I didn't even know they grew blueberries in Peru. But all they did with that minimum wage was outsource jobs to way poorer people making way less money.
Well, the whole agricultural labor thing is something, of course, I know a lot about, and how they've pushed a lot of that to other countries. Now you're seeing grapes and blueberries from Central and South America. All that stuff used to be in my old stomping grounds in the San Joaquin Valley. So yeah, I mean, we are transforming the economy for the worse with these influences, and as I talked about at the beginning, where we are with labor now is I think you have these unions are really captured entities within the halls of power. And it's not within the nature of any entity that walks in the halls of power to truly be able to represent, quote unquote, like the little guy, so to speak. So it has fallen from what it was. Now, what's interesting, I will say, about the Starbucks thing, and this is the part they don't really talk about in the media. The Starbucks thing is really interesting because in most of the circumstances with Starbucks workers, they have not utilized one of the established unions. these are actually back to, we're seeing sort of this little trend of workers forming their own little unions within their own workplace and raising their own voice, which has its own set of difficulties to it, but I think it's a far superior way for them to go. And I would encourage them to do that if they're going to do this. Now, the problem for these Starbucks workers
It was
is they got to
Starbucks
realize,
that I saw the plant.
right. Well, what's going to happen in Starbucks is what Starbucks workers truly don't understand is they probably have it about as good as they'll ever get it, because Starbucks is so easy to automate. I mean,
Right. I mean, that's the thing.
coffee
That's
is
the
just like,
thing.
you can make a machine that spits out X ounces of coffee, X ounces of water, X ounces of cream.
Right.
I mean, it's so easy to automate that.
So
and
it's
just have
easier
it-
than McDonald's.
Yeah, I mean, it's even easier. And that's easy, right? I mean, so these are all jobs that are going to disappear.
No, but what I'm saying is the plant that I saw was at Starbucks. So I'm wondering if it's Starbucks' plan to have the unionized thing give them cover for automating.
Probably. I mean, they're playing games with those kids at the bargaining table because those kids are not equipped. I've been following it. They're not. They don't know what they're doing. But
I mean, I feel like that's by design.
I'd rather have that than see the UAW making money off of it as they do. And I mean, the level of corruption within these unions, as with anything that gets captured and gets money poured into it, the corruption goes hand in hand with it, and their involvement. It's just. It's not what it was intended to be, and it's not really collective bargaining is broken because of it. And it's what are being reported as like this union resurgence and union victories are PR, because as I mentioned, we're not seeing the union representation in the private sector rising. They haven't turned the things around, even though legally things are much more favorable for them legally. And we have only seen the beginning. The R&D on automation has only begun. Like, they're doing essentially, when you see a couple of kiosks in your McDonald's, that's beta testing.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And they're also training us. Grocery stores are a fantastic example of this. Go to Walmart sometime. They still have rows and rows and rows and rows and rows of lines. And some of us, Monica, are old enough to remember when you used to go to the grocery store, and if there were more than like two people in a line, they'd pick up the microphone and they'd scurry to get another. They did not want you waiting in line. They want you waiting in line now, so you go use the self-check.
That's right.
100%.
100%.
They're training you.
They're doing that at the airport too, to get you to do clear.
Mm-hmm.
They're slowing things down. So a couple of things. Some quack says Starbucks has already put a lot of money into automating their espresso machines for efficiency over the past 20 years. So this is probably they're probably ready now. So they're going to let these kids, and what happens is, even if the kids win, just by attrition, they'll stop. They just won't hire any more people ever. And then it's over. So what you've done is destroyed an industry without necessarily hurting yourself. But I wanted to make a point about the slowdowns.
Before you do, let me grab something I want to show you. Hold on.
Okay.
I know I'm not supposed to do this, but it's right.
That's all right.
I don't know how well this is going to show on the camera, but this is a very rare piece of artwork.
I can see it. Go ahead. Tell me what it is.
And what this depicts, a friend of mine gave this to me, an old friend. This is a piece of propaganda we used to use against the United Farm Workers Union in election campaigns. And that's the UFW's Black Eagle symbol turned into a vulture. And it's standing over a graveyard, and all the gravestones are companies that were under United Farm Workers contract that went out of business. And it shows the date they were founded and the date they went out of business as the birth and death dates. And then in the foreground, there's an open grave with a question mark in it.
Please take a picture of that so I can include it in the post when I post this.
This is one of only two. So the guy who originally drew this drew a bunch of them and handed them out to all of us so we could use them. And this is and then we all Xeroxed it over and over and over again. And God, I'm old. We use Xerox machines.
A Mimeo. You Mimeoed it.
And I didn't think there were any originals left. And a dear old friend of mine gave me that. And
it's an original.
there are only two actual original pen drawings that exist. That one and the one my friend
Wow.
has.
Well, I need a photo of it so I can include it. I absolutely want to include it in the posting of this
But
show.
that's the message I think that how are unions destructive? They do destroy industries ultimately.
Right.
Never forget when you talk about minimum wage, and this is not a conspiracy, this is well documented. Minimum wage was a eugenics initiative. The whole idea behind minimum wage was to
Yes.
starve subnormal people out of existence, to make
I
it
think also it had to
impossible
do
people they saw as deficient, make it impossible for them to survive.
it coincided with, I believe, migration of blacks from south to north. And then they were like, okay, we can keep them from getting these jobs if you make the floor of wages so high that really only an experienced worker could justify that employment position.
Black people were one of the groups that they saw as deficient, but they didn't want people who were disabled, people who were black, people. They didn't want people who could go to somebody and say, "I'll sweep your floor for a hot meal and a bed for the night."
Right.
Right? And some small shop owner says, "Yeah,
Yeah.
you know what? We got a little extra food for dinner tonight. We can feed you, and I got a cot. Go
Yeah.
ahead and sweep my floor." They
Yeah.
wanted to prevent that. They wanted to make it impossible for people at the fringes of society to
Why?
survive by selling their labor for what it was worth in the market.
They wanted them to die or what?
Yes.
Oh my
And
gosh.
there's lots and lots. You can go down the Google rabbit hole on it.
I think that's
It's
probably
well,
in this
people
book.
who were within the Roosevelt administration talked about this openly, that minimum wage would make it impossible for these folks to survive. Now, the railroad union really was strong behind it because black workers were dominating the railroad by undercutting the wages of white workers.
Yeah, this book, it says in only one place of redress, Bernstein offers a bold reinterpretation of American legal history, arguing that American labor and occupational laws enacted by state and federal governments after the Civil War and into the 20th century benefited dominant groups in society to the detriment of those who lacked political power. Both intentionally and incidentally, those laws restricted, in particular, the job mobility and economic opportunity of blacks, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, I think that I can probably find some of those answers right in here in this cool book.
Right,
But
back at that
yeah.
uncomfortable time that they tried to memory hole when eugenics was an appropriate thing for people to be in favor of.
Yeah.
Right, which was the era, by the way. I believe the Fair Labor Standards Act was 1933. I believe
Yes, it
Fair
was.
Labor Standards Act. So that would have been at a time when it was appropriate, and it was actually fashionable to be in support of eugenics.
Yeah, it's in the
And
congressional record.
and there are statements among intellectuals of the time and people within the Roosevelt administration that they literally wanted to make it impossible for sort of the subnormals of the world to survive.
Yeah.
So, that
Interesting.
eugenics history runs deep in our culture, and that stuff is all still buried there. Within we're still pushing up minimum wage.
My son went to a high school in LA that was super, super liberal, whatever, but it was established by eugenicists back in the day. And I'm like, don't they realize and they were like total COVID Nazis? And I'm like, they haven't changed. But so I did want to just make a little point about my own family. My uncle was in the union, and he said when he showed up for work and he was just a go-getter and he was trying to work, the union guys would just all go like this to him, like slow down, put their hand up. And part of it wasn't just that they didn't want to work that hard, which absolutely was. They were government, like in New York, everything is unionized. So all the road work, everything's super, super unionized. And a lot of it's like government contracts. So there's like nobody minding the store, nobody pulling on the other. I always think of it as, unionized government situations. Like it's a tug of war, but there's nobody on the other end of the rope.
Construction works in two ways.
But hold on, let me finish this one thing, which is one of the reasons they wanted them to slow down was because they wanted the contract to last longer. And if you did the work too fast, everybody would be out of a job.
Well, one of the most poisonous things that unions always insist on in contracts, they love seniority systems. Seniority is the thing that they always want to be the dividing line. And the problem with seniority systems is that it destroys the incentive for people to perform, right? What seniority encourages you to do is do just good enough of a job to not get fired. Because then as you build up your seniority, you make more
Right.
money just from being there, right? But that kid who is a go-getter, who's just starting out and he wants to like conquer the world, goes out and conquers the world, but nothing happens except until that clock advances. So his motivation gets beaten out of him by the seniority system itself.
It burns out. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't think of that.
It's more insidious than the labor cost part of unions, is that employers cannot reward those who strive and cannot build a culture in which people are competing with each other and they're striving to achieve, because there's no benefit to it. You can't reward anyone for it. So, people respond according to their incentives, and the seniority system just incentivizes everybody to be in that flat line of mediocrity, right?
Yeah, I mean, the education, school teachers and stuff, it seems like that's a big thing there.
So it's one of the most insidious parts of unionization is the love affair with seniority. And this is a big generalization, but what I generally see in unionized workplaces is that the workers who are the most ambitious, the most hardworking, the most determined to succeed, typically are unhappy being unionized. And the people that are at the weaker end of the scale tend to really like their union.
When I used to be on the radio, I'd get a lot of calls from people who complained about their union shops. They hated being in a union. Maybe it's a self-selected group of people who were listening to libertarian radio.
I mean, my wife is a public school teacher, so she really liked the union in one district that she was in, and felt they stood up for her against issues with the administration. And she's a special education teacher, so a lot of times she has to kind of fight for her kids and finds herself at odds with the system. But she was in another district where she didn't find the union to be helpful at all. So it can vary from place to place, but in general, I think it's a flawed structure because of the economics of it and because of how captured it's become. And if you're ever going to have it work the way that it really should work as an economic force for workers to gain an equal footing, or at least a better footing at the bargaining table, it has to be something, as flawed as it might be, and it has to be something that the workers are doing for themselves. And you having this massive structure that siphons away their wages to the benefit of massive corporate structure that pours money into politics to feed corruption. It's the same problem that we have of why we have this massive government structure that interferes with the market in the first place. As much as I mock libertarians, they're not wrong about the importance of markets and the importance of competition.
Yes.
And the general idea that
just the institution has been corrupted, like with everything else.
Well, I tend to be more of a mind that corruption is inevitable and government is inevitable. I don't believe the stateless society is possible. I actually think what we should strive for is a government that's very inept, but dominated by low-level corruption, right? So when you want to get a permit to build something onto your house, you should know who the guy is and how much it's going to cost you to get that permit. That's an acceptable form of corruption because it's economic exchange, and you're getting something that actually benefits you from this crappy government. The problem we have in our government now is all of that graft is happening at such a high level.
Yes.
We get nothing, and we don't know what the price tag is.
That is certainly
the never-ending price tag, and we get nothing for it.
That's an original take. I hadn't thought of that, but it definitely does. I do feel powerless. But I have to say one thing, and then I want you to tell me anything you think we haven't covered. But as I've been in crappy jobs, I've been in bad like roommate situations, and over the years, I have concluded that for me, the most important liberty is freedom of association. To work where you don't want to work, with whom you do not want to work, to have no control over that, and also like no control over with whom you live or whatever. That is just misery having to associate with people you don't like. But when an industry gets hijacked or corrupted by something like this, I do believe people have callings. Like maybe you want this job, you want to do a certain job. So if the industry is completely overrun by unions, you cannot do that job unless you're part of this association that you don't approve of or is exploitive. I feel like that's just it's just a bad. It's a public bad.
Yeah, I mean, my general advice to anybody, and it's the advice that I've given to my own kids, is do whatever you can and whatever you have to do to put yourself in a position where you can, even if it's a business of one, that you can be your own business and control your
Yeah.
own income. I mean, it was the smartest thing I ever did
Yeah.
to, even to the point of like, I thought I was doing that when I was a partner in the big law firm. I had
Mhm.
22 partners and I was part of an institution. And in the end of it, I realized I wasn't really in control of anything. So I started my own thing, and there was a lot of like headache and heartache and all of that. But
Yep.
it was the smartest thing that
Yeah.
I ever did, both in terms of money that I made, but more than the money was the freedom to feel like I had my own destiny within my own control. And especially when COVID came along, I had no idea something like that was going to happen. But when COVID came along, the fact that I had this economic resource of owning this business, that I could do what I wanted to do and I didn't have to follow rules that I didn't want to follow, and I could go where I wanted to go. That was something that was very reassuring for me. And so whatever, if there's young people that are listening to this, whatever it is that you want to pursue, think of it like a business and figure out how to make money at it, where, you don't have to make a lot of money to make as much as you're making in your crappy job.
Right.
If you control your overhead,
Right.
if you control cost, you can make the same money you're making in your
Yeah.
crappy job doing something where, even if it's hard, that you have control.
Right. I agree totally. Have you ever read Ted Kaczynski's manifesto? It's in a book called Technological
I
Slavery.
have not read the whole thing, but I have read parts of it.
Well, he talks about the power principle, which there's 4 elements of it, but you need to have autonomy. What you do needs to have meaning. It has to be hard. I forget the last one, but I do think that when you switch from working for somebody or working in an institution, working in a matrixy thing, to doing your own, the satisfaction you get and the like psychological value of that, you don't really need that much money. You really don't need that. You don't actually need the luxuries, because the fulfillment, you only have to treat yourself when you're miserable all the time. Like the fulfillment of having something that's worthwhile, you don't need to get, you don't, and you don't need to consume as much. And of course, that's part of the whole rigged system.
No, I agree. I'm a person who sold my business at
Yeah.
its peak earning. I sold it,
Oh my God.
paid off all my debts, and moved to the middle of nowhere. So.
Yeah, I'm so happy for you. And should we tease what a 180 we're gonna do in our next episode together in celebration of Christmas? We're gonna at your suggestion, which I think is a great one, although I'm not sure I'm up for the task. I think you and I both were born, raised Catholic, then went away from the church and went back to the church. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And we're going to talk about that process. And I personally, like, people ask me why some people think I'm black pilled, but if they actually listen to my show, they know that I'm not, because I have a lot of joy and hope, and I only can get any kind of hope out of the idea that there's something greater that
Well, what I would remind people of who feel that way, who feel black pilled or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of how to describe sort of the whether you want to call it kind of more right wing or more libertarian folks, which tend to populate those spheres. And I tell my kids this, that to keep in mind that what I think is the greatest crime of our time by our so-called adversaries, this sort of leftist, elitist, whatever that we live under, is their continuing desire and their incredible effort to steal hope from young people. To tell young people they're going to die in 10 years, they shouldn't even bother to have children, that there's no future. You can never buy a house. Look at how unfair the system is. You'll never be able to buy a house.
Right.
Oh, you're black. You live in a white supremacist world. You can't do anything.
Yes, very disempowering.
This messaging that young people are being inundated with about how the world is against them and they can never have anything.
I worry about that with some of the conspiracy podcasts. Some of the bigger names
Well,
in,
that's why
they are just black pill
that's
constant, and
why
it's
I'm saying this.
bad.
So
Yeah.
remind yourself that's the weapon they're using against our children.
Both sides are using it.
That's the weapon. Don't do it yourself. Don't do it
Right.
too. I tell my kids all the time to dream big and do like when I talk to my kids about stuff like my feelings on things like climate change, and my kids are young. I mean, they're young adults now, and one's in college, one's out of college, so they've been hit with a lot of indoctrination. When I talk about things like climate change, I tell them I don't believe in it, and I tell them I think that I hate it because it tells people, young people like them, to not have hope. And I tell them, reject it, have hope. The world's not going to blow up in 10 years. We're not all going to boil. We're not all going to burn. They're lying to you. Plan for your future because it's there.
Nice. Well,
And
that's
I
an
encourage,
excellent way.
my oldest just got out of, he's going to be mad I talked about him, but my oldest one just got out of college. He graduated this past year. He went to school and studied jazz guitar.
I make fun of people like that.
I know, but the funny
But actually, he knows something, unlike my kids who are probably getting
he's making
brainwashed.
a living with the guitar. So
That's amazing. Plus,
he
it was
teaches,
valuable time.
he teaches guitar at School of Rock, which is a nationwide franchise now.
That's great.
He performs in what he calls a boomer rock cover band.
I love that.
They play weddings and country clubs and HOA events, and he's making good money doing that. And then he has his own band on the side with his friends, but he's paying his bills with it. And he's dreaming of someday having his own guitar studio where he can record, he can teach. He's getting really into like building custom guitars. He's customized a guitar for himself. And he's thinking of this very commercially of he doesn't want to work for somebody else.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
But the most important thing is like that I'm proud of as a dad is that I taught my kids to dream about the future and dream big about the future and chase whatever it is that they think those dreams are. But they get hit with so much like hopelessness. And that's why I say like so many in our quote unquote sphere, as you say, conspiracy folks want to believe that everything's falling apart. I just refuse to live that way. It's a terrible way to live.
Right. And there's, what if it doesn't? I mean, you can't, first of all, you can't live like that. And there isn't that much we can do about what's happening at the top. So spending a lot of time worrying about it is a waste. And so, all right, so let's say the world's going to end in 10 years. That's even more important to build your own guitar. It's even more important to do something worthwhile.
And I think faith gives you the ability to embrace that view of hope in the world.
All right. Well, that's where we're going to pick up on our next episode, which is December 20th at 10 a.m. Pacific, right here you can get it at youtube.com/Monica Perez or Monica Perez Show. I don't even know. And of course, that's how you can listen live and participate and get into the chat with other people. And then, but of course, we'll always be in the feed. So that's it. So we'll be together again before Christmas. So I will wish everybody a happy Advent, let's say, and then we can talk about Christmas on the 20th.
Well, thank you again for having me.
Thank you. All right, guys. I'm going to see if I can play my outro because I forgot to play my intro before. And then Anthony, if you'll hold on. Oh, you don't have to hold on. We can go. All right. I will see you soon. Thanks for coming. Bye, everybody.